Hey, I'm Rabbi Jeffrey Weill, and this is Unveiling Death. Death Café. Talking about death won't kill you. In this episode, I speak with Donna Stein-Harris, a Death Café facilitator. Donna is from Chicago, but she and her husband, now deceased, retired to Traverse City, Michigan 10 years ago. Donna spent most of her career in the community safety and health field, including working with the National Safety Council to develop Safe Communities America. The Death Café concept was first conceived in Europe a couple of decades ago. It was then more formally organized in England, and it now takes place in more than 80 countries. According to its website, quote, at a Death Café, people gather to eat cake, drink tea, and discuss death. Our objective is to increase awareness of death with a view to helping people make the most of their finite lives. And now let's get to the conversation. Hello, Donna Stein-Harris. Welcome to Unveiling Death.
Hello, Jeffrey.
I'm really excited to talk to you about your career in Death Café and about Death Café. So I'll just start with this. You began facilitating Death Café. So of all the things that one might choose to do in retirement, I mean, there's pickleball. there's a lot of other things that one could be doing in retirement, including in the volunteer realm. Why would one choose to be a facilitator for something called Death Café?
Well, like most people when they retire, at least for me, I think, oh my God, I'm just after a long career, what am I going to do next? And a friend of my daughter's was doing something called Death Café, and she was having a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, how can that be? You know, it just didn't compute for me. And I thought, I need to look into this. And because I was getting older and friends were dying and old acquaintances were very ill and considering very difficult decisions, I said, I need to look into this. Well, anyway, that's what I did. And Death Cafe is really an international movement, and I had no understanding of it at all. And the whole idea behind it is to get people together to talk about difficult end-of-life issues.
Right.
And what intrigued me most was once you got into it, it wasn't difficult. It was just the idea that it was difficult. And there was so much fear and unknown around it that I said, yeah, I could do this. It
Right.
intrigues me. And if it intrigues me, that other people must be intrigued by it.
Right.
And
Right.
that's what got me started.
Yeah, so I'm curious, like when you were like 10 years before you started doing this, or 20 years before you started doing this, and you were looking ahead to what you might do at this stage of your life, is there
Mhm.
anything that you would have said, like, yeah, I mean, that would make sense for me. I'm curious about these kinds of things. I'm not weirded out by it. I'm not intimidated by it. I'm intrigued by it. Would you have thought, even when you were in your 20s or 30s, that being involved in the death sort of world would make sense for you?
It never even occurred to me.
Mm-hmm.
Death was way in the future. And so death even as a concept was so remote. And so no, I had never even thought about it until just after I retired.
Right. Wow. Wow. So you had done some facilitating in your previous career, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Can you explain that?
I worked in community safety and health, and my job was to get people within a community to work together toward those goals to make sure that their communities were safe. So I had lots of opportunities to do team building and to facilitate groups, getting people to talk to each other. So that part for me was easy. I had done a lot of public speaking. So I wasn't intimidated at all by that aspect of it.
Right. Right. So when you are starting a group, whether you're actually initiating, launching a group, or you're just starting a session, do you have certain starter questions? I mean, if you want a group to go in a certain direction or a session to go in a certain direction, do you lead a group there? And I'm asking it for this reason. I actually attended a Death Cafe Zoom group last week, and it was really interesting. And I didn't know if it would be focused on practical issues like directives and,
Hmm.
trust and estate issues or medical and insurance issues, or if we'll be talking about something that I would personally find more intriguing, like near-death experiences,
Hmm.
um, what happens when you die in the afterlife and that sort of thing. And I feel like those are very different kinds of approaches to these kinds of conversations. So based, I guess, on your own personal orientation or how you feel when you're about to begin a session, like in what direction do you facilitate these groups?
The way my groups operate is when we first get together, and they just come from word of mouth. I don't do any advertising. I don't have a website. It's just people talking to people. I ask them what they're interested in, and it's everything.
Hmm.
It's everything from medical directives, or how do you have a difficult conversation with your family, or are you afraid to die, or
Right.
what happens when you die, all of those things. So I ask them to write that down. I scientifically and put it in a baggie and
Mhm.
mix it up. And at the beginning of every session, somebody picks out one of these little pieces of paper, and that's where our conversation starts. Everybody has a story to tell, and everybody wants to tell their story. So my groups meet for 12 months, once a month for 12 months, and we get to everything.
Right.
Everything is discussed, from all the practical issues and the hard work there is around preparing for end of life, as well as what happens afterwards. So we get to it all.
Right.
And if we have finished a particular topic, or I mean, that's my job as a facilitator to say, I think we're done with this topic. Let's pick out another piece of paper and start on a new topic.
Obviously it's a self-selecting group. People are choosing to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Do some people come because they are petrified of death, like they're getting older and they are just really scared,
Mm-hmm.
or that not happen because those folks would not be drawn to such a group?
Um, I think you're right. I think that some people are afraid to talk about these topics, and they might self-select not to go. In the time I've been doing it, I've had a few people drop out because they felt it was uncomfortable. But for the
Mhm.
most part, they come with different expectations, and um, they see where it goes.
Right. Do you personally have a preference? I mean, I know that you're a facilitator, obviously, but you also have your own interests and everything else. Do
Mhm.
you, I mean, do you prefer or get more engaged when something comes out of that baggie that like, oh yeah, this is going to be cool, or other things you're like, oh, another conversation about medical directives. Oh,
Oh,
does that happen?
you know, medical directives is pretty
No,
interesting.
I was nothing against medical directives. That was
And
just an
let,
example.
and let me tell you why.
Uh,
Because when you go through that medical directive process, you have to think about all these things that are important to you.
right.
And it does talk about fear. We do talk about fear, because if you have to decide whether you want to be resuscitated or not, that addresses that fear. I mean, the discussion often goes in that direction,
Mhm.
because if you say, well, okay, I'm letting my son or my daughter or whatever be my proxy, and that's the person who's going to make the decisions for me and so forth. Yeah, that's an easier question. But when you say, under what circumstance do I want to be resuscitated, or do I want to be resuscitated at all?
Yeah.
That gets that gets to those fear
Those
questions.
are big questions. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. What about other questions like those near death experiences? NDEs, near death experiences seem very like in right now. You go to like do a search of podcasts or Google search for an NDE and there's so much that comes up. Or
Hmm.
like I did a podcast last month probably about heaven and hell with a very conservative Lutheran minister. Like these are kind of like the things that stoke my imagination,
Hmm.
and like, oh my gosh, that's really talk about those things, sort of like the goth things in a way. Do people, does that come up a lot, or is it more practical stuff? And related to this question, who's coming to the group? Is it people who are really facing these questions, not imminently, but they've reached a stage of life where they need to be focusing on these kind of more practical questions, like what do I do? Or do you have people who are just kind of death fascinated in their 30s?
No, it's an older demographic for sure.
Right.
But as young as 50s, I mean,
Mhm.
that's, to me, that's young. I would say that the groups range from an average of 55 to 85.
Mhm.
Uh, and uh, and why do they come? Yeah, we talk about near-death experiences, but only if they've had those near-death experiences. It's not something anybody makes up or projects about. It's always personal.
Uh-huh.
And they also come because they are concerned not only for themselves, but for, let's say they have an aging parent. So a 55-year-old would certainly have different issues than somebody my age. Um, so there's that. And then there's also questions about parents who have dementia, and how do we handle those kinds of issues? And then how do we talk to our children about what we want? I think I'd like to make an important point here. You know, Prior to the last 10 or 15 years, death and all related issues were outsourced in this country. Other people were making decisions for us. You became ill, you went into the hospital, then you went into nursing homes, assisted living, then you died, and then you had a funeral home, and you were kind of pushed along in that death continuum, but without any say. It's changed now. People have options, and they're empowered to
Right.
make those decisions prior to their death, waiting for other people to decide.
Right.
So that intrigued me too. It's empowering, and I
Sure.
think the Death Cafe experience is empowering.
Wow.
Oh, I didn't know I could do that.
Yeah.
Oh, I had no idea that those options even existed.
Interesting. Yeah, the word that we often use these days is agency. Like the people who are
Agency.
getting
Yeah.
older and dying
Hmm.
have a sense of agency that they did not possess previously.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. When I was in college, I took a big class in the sociology department called Birth and Death. And it was like in an auditorium, and the professor was literally on a stage, sitting down there, and honestly, it felt a little bit like a cult figure. And because we're all like he's just sitting down and talking, and but the main message of the class was the acceptance of death. That's not a bad message at all, of course, but that was like what you really, that's what the readings, the syllabus, and the pontificating from the stage was getting at, just accepting mortality, and that's good. I wrote my final paper on the longevity movement, which in a sense is sort of the opposite of that. Like, what can we do to, what advances are happening then? This is in the late 80s or mid to late 80s in science that are allowing people to live longer. I thought it
Mhm.
was a pretty well researched paper. I got, I think, a C or like a C minus or something like that, because it wasn't sort of accepting that ethos of death acceptance. At least that's how I remember it. But
Mhm.
I'm wondering if there is that kind of assumption or ethos in the Death Cafe groups as you've been experiencing them? Like, or is it, do people come wanting that to be affirmed, or do people come saying, I actually want to live a long time and I'm trying to figure out how to stave off that that darkness, or
Mhm.
that nothingness of death?
There are people who fight to the last breath for medical intervention
Right.
or for some miracle so that they will never die. I mean, they expect immortality. There are others who are more accepting, and um, and it's easier for those folks, but it's not based on just one factor.
Right.
I mean, when you think about it, and you ask who comes to these groups too, um, people from different community cultures, different people from different religious cultures, which makes it a really rich discussion.
Right.
Different family cultures. It's everything. So I think the one of the benefits, or the for me, the beauty of witnessing these discussions, is where people say, "Oh my God, I never thought about it like that." Not that it's going to change the way they feel, but there's a greater understanding that, oh, I don't have to think a certain way because my mother told me to.
Right.
When I was growing up, my mother used to say to me, "Dead is dead."
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? You
Right.
know, it's
Right.
the end of what?
Right.
And so when people are fearful about dying, it's not often about just being dead. It's about, will people remember me? What's
Right.
my legacy?
Yeah.
How long, how many generations have to pass before my name is never mentioned again?
Right. Right.
So that's a part of the discussion as well.
Being remembered.
Being
Yeah.
remembered.
Right. It's good. So your mom would say dead is dead. That could be pretty daunting for a
Yeah.
young person to hear. Not that it's wrong, obviously, but you can't argue with that kind of statement. Has this experience the last decade as a Death Cafe facilitator then changed your own attitude about death? And I mean that, I guess, in a couple of ways. Way number one is your attitude about getting older and taking those steps towards that inevitability, like that attitude approaching death, and also the attitude of like what happens when one dies. Has that changed? And has your mom's, I mean, you mentioned you're still remembering what your mom saying dead is dead. Has that
Mhm.
that obviously still resonates with you somehow, right? That's also in your head.
Yeah, actually, it has made it easier. And the downside of it being easier is I'm very comfortable with the topic, and and
Right.
sometimes that's off-putting for people.
Uh-huh. Have
Uh,
you had experiences in which that would have been off-putting, in which that was
oh yeah,
off-putting?
actually, recently I was on a trip and met some new people, and I was with another friend whose husband had died, and somewhere in the conversation they said to us, "Well, where are your husbands?"
Hmm.
And I said, "Oh, they're dead."
Right.
And that stopped the conversation. Not using the euphemism of, well, they've
Pass
passed,
away.
they're in
Yeah.
a better place, all
Right.
those kinds of things. I don't
Right.
talk about death that way anymore.
Right.
I'm very comfortable with it. I know what my options are. I know, I, I talk to groups all the time about what is a good death, and I hope to influence that for myself.
But what is a good death?
A good death is one that you've prepared for,
Hmm.
and one that you've thought through. Now, sometimes there are unexpected deaths, and that's tragic, especially with younger people
Of
and
course.
so forth.
Hmm.
But if we talk about death as a continuum of the life's process, um, there's so much that you can do to make it easier for yourself, make it easier for your family, having everything in place, which gives people a sense of calm and control. And if that is achieved, then you have had a good death.
Right.
Um, Nobody knows when, or how. I mean, that's
Right.
not something that we know. But if everything is prepared, and if you've set the course, if you will,
Right.
made those decisions, then that's generally a good death.
Right. So you mentioned your husband having passed away, his memory for
Yes.
passing. So was everything prepared in that good death sort of way before he died? And did that make
Yes.
things better for you? Yeah.
Oh my God, in every way.
Hmm.
And even even before he had a terminal illness, and so it was not unexpected. But we had people come to the house all the time and talk to him, and he wasn't. Often people don't know what to say or what to do, and you just be welcoming and so forth. And now he had a curiosity about it. People would say, "Are," because he was very comfortable talking about what was happening, people would say, "Are you afraid?" He says, "No, I'm just curious."
Hmm.
So that
Right.
was kind of interesting.
Right.
But all the preparations had been made, all the decisions had been made, and he had done that. And so he had, like in any family or whatever, there are issues that are sometimes open wounds and so forth, that had all been dealt with.
Right.
He had planned for this, and good discussions had taken place. No, it made all the difference in the world.
Wow. Wow. And I deal with a lot of this because I'm a congregational rabbi, so I'm dealing with people who are dealing with their loved ones' losses, the losses of their loved ones frequently.
Right.
And I see that. I mean, I see those who have been prepared for it in a sense, the good death, and those who really have not, and this makes it much more difficult before and then after the death.
Right.
Yet the sadness is the sadness.
You can't get around that, of course.
Right.
You know.
Yeah.
No, I've said to my children, I said, I want you to celebrate my life. I don't want you to be sad. And they were like, wait a minute, that means we can't cry. I said, you want to cry, go ahead and cry. But also understand the joy in it as well.
Right.
So,
The joy in it.
yeah, I think so.
The joy in it, as in, you know, they have their relationships. We have our relationships with our loved ones who are dying or who have died. We celebrate those relationships. We understand that one generation goes, another generation arises. Is that what you mean by the joy in it?
Yeah, exactly. And I know that this is something you probably come across too all the time. You know, when somebody dies, you know, what do you say? What do you write on that card? What's going to provide comfort or whatever? But it's always may may their memories be a blessing.
Absolutely.
You know, it's what was your experience with that person? And you have to remember that.
So the second part of the question is your feelings about when you die. When we die, has that changed over the last decade of your facilitating Death Café?
Yeah, I'm not afraid anymore. I'm not. It's inevitable, and I hope it's easy. Obviously, I hope it's fast. You know, all those kinds of things that we all hope for. But the plans have been made. It's all in this little white box and sitting in my closet, and everybody knows where it is.
But I mean, like, what happens when you die? Like, has that changed? Like your mom said, dead is dead, but like, have your feelings about what death is, have they evolved over the last decade?
Well, yeah, I think so, because I've always thought of death again is so final, and it isn't. It's just another step in the continuum. Um, I'm I don't want my death to be painful. You know, again, when I ask people, "Are you afraid to die?" Almost inevitably, people say, "No, I'm not afraid to die. I'm afraid of dying."
Right.
They don't want to be in pain. They don't want to suffer. They don't want anybody to witness their suffering.
Right.
I'm not afraid of that anymore at all.
Right.
Because I know that we live in an era where nobody has to suffer when they die.
Right. Do you think about afterlife much? The afterlife?
I've thought about it. I'm curious about it. I don't
Right.
dismiss it as a topic or an issue. Um, so, you know, I share my husband's curiosity. Let's put it that way.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
So the final question, which we talked about before we went on air. What song, I think about this a lot. I don't really have an answer for myself, but you do.
I do.
You're on your deathbed. Again, long time for now, Donna. You're on your deathbed, and what song do you want to hear in your ears during your final moments?
And that was an easy answer for me, Jeffrey. The song is Dancing Queen by ABBA. And the reason it is, first of all, it's a timeless song. It's a nostalgic song. It's a joyful song. And and that's what I want. I want the environment to be joyful. I want people to be thinking about the past and the future. And that song does it for me.
Right. It also evokes something else you mentioned to me.
Yes, there is. One of my very favorite stories is the story of Miriam, Moses' sister, and how when they're fleeing Egypt, she brings the tambourines. And my understanding of that story is there is always something to be joyful about, even in times of great stress. And in that song, in the Dancing Queen song, there is a reference to tambourines.
Right.
So it comes full circle for me.
Right. Well, that's a great answer. That's a great song. I'm going to put that on my list.
Yeah. I love that song.
So, Donna Stein-Harris, this has been a great, great pleasure talking to you about your own feelings about death and about Death Cafe. So greatly appreciate your being on Unveiling Death.
Well, my pleasure as well. Thank you.